Tonight's topic is the Book of Nahum. So a slightly unusual topic, I know, and I guess the background to it is that I am teaching HSC Ancient History this year, and part of the course is actually looking at ancient Assyria, and specifically the reign of Sennacherib. So my motivations are somewhat selfish in that I took the opportunity to try and scrub up a little bit on Assyrian history, because Nahum is a prophecy very specifically about Assyria. But at the same time, it's also, I guess, an area of scripture that's a little bit understudied. We don't always look at Nahum. So, and tonight we're actually going to be covering the whole book. So hopefully you get some value out of it as well. And yes, thank you for letting me do some study at your expense. So let's talk about Nahum the man to start off with. Well, he's a bit of an enigma. Very little is known about Nahum. We're actually only told the name of his hometown, which is Elkosh. It says in the New King James Version that Stephen read there that he was an Elkoshite. So he was from Elkosh, and even the location of that is uncertain. So Smith's Bible Dictionary intriguingly actually suggests a location in Assyria, quite close to Nineveh, where this prophecy is directed. So it's possible that Nahum might have been an Assyrian or maybe an Israelite exile prophesying in Assyria, but we're not sure. Smith's Bible Dictionary equally lists a location that's a small village near Galilee. Because of this, Nahum's name functions almost like what you would call a literary cipher, where the name itself is more important for its meaning rather than exactly who Nahum was, given we actually know nothing about him. So the name Nahum means comfort. It's actually quite similar to the name Nehemiah, which is Yahweh comforts. The first part of the name there is the same in Hebrew. And the reason this name is significant and almost slightly ironic is because this prophecy would bring comfort to Judah and discomfort to Nineveh, to whom it's directed. This is a prophecy that does not have good news for Nineveh at all. So that's just a little bit of backdrop. In some ways, Nahum is quite a simple study, and there's one way in which it is. We have no idea really who he was, but yeah, he does have an interesting name given the content of this book. This is a map of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and its expansion. This is the empire towards whom this prophecy is directed. And this is a really helpful map because it shows, the expansion over time, and it's helpful to establish a bit of a timeline for this prophecy. So Nahum chapter 3 and verses 8 to 10 refer to the fall of Thebes as being past. You can see Thebes down there in southern Egypt, in the light yellow there. Refers to that, the fall of Thebes as already having happened. So the prophecy must have been written post 663 BC. That's when we know the fall of Thebes happened. And the fall of Nineveh is prophesied as being imminent. That's the language of this prophecy. So it seems that it was probably written shortly before 612 BC, which was when Nineveh fell. So it was probably contemporary with the reign of King Josiah in Judah. So that would make this roughly 100 years after the fall of Israel, the northern kingdom, who were taken into captivity by the Assyrians, and about 25 years before the fall of Judah. So Judah is still a kingdom at this time, but not for much longer. Now, Nahum is actually only one of two books, it's one of two books in the Old Testament centered on Nineveh. Anyone know what the other one is?
Jonah.
Yeah, right. Yep, Jonah is the other book that's centered on Nineveh. And interestingly, Jonah is also the only other Old Testament book that's focused on prophecy to the Gentiles. And there's one more similarity between the books as well that we'll look at tonight. So there's some interesting focus here. Nineveh sort of comes to represent sort of the city of the Gentiles in Old Testament prophecy. So it's worth, given that our familiarity with Nineveh primarily comes from Jonah, rewinding a bit and asking the question, what has happened since the time of Jonah? in Assyria and Nineveh. So Jonah prophesied in Nineveh sometime between 793 and 753 BC, when Nineveh was an important cultural and religious center, but actually not yet the capital. When Jonah prophesied at Nineveh, it was a very important cultural center. It was the center of the worship of the cult of Ishtar, but it wasn't actually the capital city. That wouldn't happen for a little while afterwards. The capital was actually Asher, which you can see there in the middle of that red blob. That's the middle of the Assyrian heartland, and it's actually what the empire was named after. And at that time when Jonah prophesied, Assyria was a regional power in northern Mesopotamia, you can see there, but it wasn't yet a true empire. Sort of occupied that light green area that you can see, so it hadn't yet fully expanded. It's possible actually that Jonah prophesied during the reign of a king named Ashur-dan III, which actually seems to have been a period of Assyrian decline. Which would be interesting because maybe the Assyrians were kind of primed and ready to hear this sort of message of doom and repentance that Jonah brought. Maybe they were in a bit of dire straits already. Yeah, just a speculation there. So following on from that, in 720 BC, Shalmaneser V conquered Samaria, and he annexed the northern kingdom of Israel, and he deported a significant part of the population. Assyria did not often have friendly relations with Israel, and the whole thing wound up there after the Israelites tried to get Egypt to defend them, but it did not work out well. 20 years later, in 701 BC, Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem, and that's a very famous episode in biblical history, and one that we're quite familiar with, when the angel of the Lord went out and slew the Assyrian host as they surrounded Jerusalem. Interestingly, we sort of all the Assyrian kings, Sennacherib is probably the most infamous for students of the Bible. But as you can see from the map there, he didn't actually leave a huge legacy in terms of imperial expansion. He really basically only succeeded in incorporating the territory of Judah. His reign was much more a reign of consolidation and reform. He wasn't quite as expansionist as some of his predecessors. And yes, while he didn't initially take Jerusalem there, he did end up incorporating the territory as kind of a vassal kingdom. The following year, in 700 BC, Sennacherib made Nineveh the capital of Assyria. So it was actually under Sennacherib that Nineveh became the capital. And yeah, we'll read about how sort of magnificent a place it became tonight. Jumping a little further on to those areas that are colored in yellow on the map. So Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal waged successful campaigns in Egypt, but they were unable to permanently incorporate the territory. And Ashurbanipal was the last great ruler of Assyria. After him, the empire started to weaken and contract. And this is kind of the very common thing in the history of great empires, is that they tend to overreach and then they become unstable and start to fall apart. In 612 BC, the Medo-Babylonian army of Cyaxares and Nabopolassar sacked Nineveh during the reign of Sin-Shar-Ishkun, and he's thought to have died in that battle, and he was the last king of Assyria, and the last king of Nineveh for that matter. So that's just a bit of an overview of what's happened since the time of Jonah. Assyria has expanded, it's taken more territory, it's become a very dangerous and powerful expansionist empire, but by the time Nahum prophesies, things are starting to get a little unstable, and shortly afterwards, the empire collapses with the conquest by the Babylonians. Now, it's worth, while we're talking about that timeline, that history, to talk about Assyrian records. Assyrian records are actually really interesting in the context of biblical archaeology. they demonstrate that they had this persistent domineering presence in the Near East, where they constantly went out raiding and taking plunder and so forth. And they're actually a very valuable archaeological source for the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So let's have a look at some examples. So the black obelisk of Shalmaneser is a very famous example. It depicts Jehu bowing and offering tribute to Assyria. He's actually circled there in red. And that's actually the only contemporary visual depiction of a king of Israel or Judah, that we have. We don't know if that's exactly what he looked like. It could just be a conventionalized representation of a king, but that one is meant to be Jehu. It says in the inscription there, which is quite interesting. That proves that Jehu was a historical king. The Rima Stele records that Jehoash paid tribute to Assyria about 40 years later. Then keeping on moving through the timeline, the Stele of Tiglath-Pileser III records that Menahem paid tribute to Assyria. So these are all biblical kings that are mentioned in these inscriptions. Another inscription of Tiglath-Pileser records that Ahaz, king of Judah, paid tribute to Assyria. And the Esarhaddon prison records that Manasseh paid tribute to Assyria as well. So yeah, this timeline illustrates a couple of things. Firstly, that the Assyrians had a pretty antagonistic relationship with Israel, certainly exacted a lot of tribute through flexing their military muscles at them. And it also shows that, yeah, the Bible is a reliable historical source. Before these kind of archaeological discoveries were made, back in the 19th century, a lot of historians were saying that the Bible just completely made up its kings, and furthermore made up a lot of the Assyrian kings as well, that these were works of fiction, but these historical records demonstrate that they're actually historical figures. So now that we've established a bit of background, let's actually start looking at the record itself. So hopefully you've still got Nahum chapter 1 opened up, and we're going to kind of skim through the book tonight. We're not going to go verse by verse the whole way through, but we're going to move on through and pick up some interesting moments and themes to try and work out what kind of a book this is, because you'll quickly realize there's a pretty specific approach that God's taking to Nineveh here, and it's quite interesting. So firstly, notice that the book starts off by foregrounding the name Yahweh in verses 2 to 3 there. We get it 5 times. It says, Yahweh is a jealous and avenging God. Yahweh is avenging and wrathful. Yahweh takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. Yahweh is slow to anger and great in power, and Yahweh will not by no means clear the guilty. So what's going on here is that the opening of the book is foregrounding that covenant name Yahweh. Now, this indicates that the judgment that's going to come on Nineveh is going to be part of and as a result of God's covenant with his people. The reason God is exacting vengeance on the Ninevites and the Assyrians is because he has made a promise to his people that he will, never leave and forsake them. And yeah, this is all part of that. So while this may be a prophecy for Nineveh, it's still very much part of the fabric of Scripture. And for any Israelites reading this book, it would remind them that God hasn't forgotten them, hasn't given up on his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to their forefathers. There's also a specific reaffirmation of the character of God here, where it says, the Lord is slow to anger and great in power. That's the character of God that was revealed to Moses in Exodus 34. But you might have noticed there's a slight modification there. To Moses, it said slow to anger and great in mercy. There's a slight shift here to slow to anger and great in power. And this is actually interesting if we compare this to Jonah, which is the other book written about Nineveh. Jonah actually sort of ironically quotes that description of God that was revealed to Moses in Jonah 4 verse 2. He says, I knew this would happen, God. I knew that you were a God slow to anger and great in mercy, and that you'd have mercy on the Ninevites. And rather than praising God for that, Jonah is actually quite disappointed that God isn't going to smush the Ninevites. It's interesting that by the time we get to this prophecy, when the Assyrians have not, changed their ways, they're still violent and aggressive and immoral and pagan, and still very much opposed to God's people. The description of God's character has changed here. He's now slow to anger, but great in power. God is definitely able to take action when he wants to do so. And this is, of course, consistent with the character of God that's revealed through the whole of the Bible. Romans 11, verse 22 says, "Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off." And we know that this is an important thing to understand about God, that he has this balance in his character, that he's a God of mercy and justice, and that while God is very much interested in showing mercy, and that is clearly expressed to be his preference in the Bible, there's also judgment for wickedness as well. Now, the whole book, and it's sort of, while we're here at the start of the book, it's worth clarifying this. And chapter 1 in particular actually makes very few specific references to Assyria and Nineveh. I'll take you through here the only verses in the entire book that actually identify the subject of the book. So Nahum 1 verse 1 at the start, it does say this is an oracle concerning Nineveh, so it's identified there. Then the next time we get any subject identified is actually in verse 15, "Keep your feasts, O Judah." That's all we have in chapter 1. That's the only times the subject are mentioned, and Nineveh's only mentioned in verse 1 there. In chapter 2, it says that God is restoring the majesty of Jacob as the majesty of Israel. And then in verse 8, Nineveh is like a pool whose waters have run away. So that's it for chapter 2. Only one mention of Nineveh there. And then in chapter 3, it says, "All who look at you will shrink from you and say, 'Wasted is Nineveh, who will grieve for her?'" And then the last reference is in verse 18, "Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria." So that's, not very many references. Only 4 references to the enemy here, to Nineveh and the Assyrians, and only 3 references to God's people. Why this is significant is that this book and the messages in it kind of start to take on more of a universal tone. They can really be applied to all of the ungodly empires of the world. And the pretty consistent message of this book is God isn't impressed. God isn't impressed by the human might and power. That doesn't mean anything to him. And that's not any excuse to abuse his people. Let's move a little bit further into chapter 1 now, at verse 4. We've got an interesting description here. It says that he, that is God, rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither. The bloom of Lebanon withers. The mountains quake before him. The hills mount. The earth heaves before him, the world and all who dwell in it. Now, if we look at a map, the description here is actually quite interesting because it seems to paint a picture of judgment kind of gradually moving in from the sea to Israel, to Lebanon, and then to the mountains. If I map that out here, it says that he rebukes the sea and makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Bashan and Carmel wither, the bloom of Lebanon withers. The mountains quake before him, the hills melt. So it sort of moves in from the sea, up the river, through northern Israel, Bashan and Carmel, through Lebanon, up into those mountain ranges in southern Turkey to the north of Assyria, and sort of pours down upon Nineveh there. Now, it's possible that what's kind of being described here is what you might call a polemic against Nineveh's unprecedented empire. A polemic is where it's sort of like this systematic deconstruction of something, where it just takes down each little element of it, verbally speaking. So Nineveh was very proud of the fact that they had this very mobile army, this big, huge reaching arm through the whole of the Near East, that they could sweep down through the Fertile Crescent along kind of the reverse of that path that's mapped there, and take what they liked from the other nations. And God's, essentially saying here to the Assyrians, yeah, I can do that too. This is, it's sort of reminiscent of the kind of thing that God did with the 10 plagues on Egypt. Each of those plagues kind of very specifically undermined a particular part of Egyptian culture and religion, those things that they had pride and confidence in. God showing that those things are actually not to be relied on above him. The New English translation actually has some interesting notes on these verses as well. He says, it says there that the Assyrians waged war every spring after the Tigris and Euphrates rivers dried up, allowing them to cross. And as the mighty warrior par excellence, the Lord is able to part the rivers to attack Assyria. So in verse 4 there it says he dries up all the rivers, just like the Assyrians would wait for the rivers to dry up before attacking. Let's jump down to the end of chapter 1 and have a look at verse 15 there. This might have kind of jumped out at you when Stephen read it earlier. It says there, behold upon the mountains the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace. So that's very familiar language, isn't it? There's some famous prophecy there that stands out to us. That's very similar language, in fact, to Isaiah 52, verse 7, if you'll turn that one up now. I might share the reading around a little bit. Dad, would you like to read Isaiah 52, verse 7?
How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace, that bringeth good tidings of good, that publisheth salvation, that saith unto Zion, thy God reigneth.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so it's a very inspiring prophecy about the good news, the gospel being published from Zion and going out into the world. So we get a bit of a hint of that here in Nahum as well, and this is then quoted actually in Romans 10. If you'll flip across there as well, Dave, could I get you to read Romans 10 verses 12 to 15?
For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord over all is rich to all who call upon him. For whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, who bring glad tidings of good things.
Thanks very much. So we can see there that Paul applies that prophecy in Isaiah in the context of, the gospel being preached into all the world. So again, what this shows is that Nahum is clearly part of the continuous narrative of Scripture. God's purpose is being accomplished here in that the destruction of Nineveh and of the enemies of God and of Israel is part of the good news. And we know that goes beyond just mortal ungodly nations. It also encompasses just sinful people and sin in general. That's part of the good news. Another interesting thing gets mentioned at the end of Nahum 1 verse 15 there, if you'll turn back across to that. It says there, keep your feasts, O Judah, fulfill your vows, for never again shall the worthless pass through you. He is utterly cut off. It's worth considering the background to that instruction, fulfill your vows. Scripture, we know, contains many examples of vows uttered in times of distress, that the speaker would serve and worship God if they were delivered. We actually get a lot of this in the Psalms, these promises that God will be glorified and worshipped if David or the psalmist is delivered. It's important that these people and us praise God when he brings us out of trouble. I'm sure there's many prayers we've uttered in times of distress, and it's really important for us to remember those and to give thanks to God when he delivers us as a result. We'll come across to chapter 2 now. Now, chapter 2 initiates this really dramatic scene. It's full of really vivid visual and vivid visual imagery that creates a mood of intensity and chaos. It's trying to create this picture of a coming battle that's going to happen in Nineveh. And then that's expanded in chapter 3, verses 2 to 3, and it sort of brings in some auditory imagery as well to create this really, really vivid, really striking picture of what's going to happen. So what I've done is I've actually tried to capture a little bit of that, tried to recreate it a little bit with some images and some sounds. Hopefully this comes through Zoom all right, but I'm gonna read out those verses for you. And as I do, I'm going to try and bring up some sounds and visuals that will help to bring out the message that's being described here. So starting in chapter 2 and verse 3 and 4, and then we're going to go over to chapter 3, verse 2. The shield of his mighty men is red. His soldiers are clothed in scarlet. The chariots come with flashing metal in the days of nothing. The cypress spears and branded. The chariots race madly through the streets. They rush to and fro through the squares. They gleam like torches. They dart like lightning. The clap of the whip, the rumble of the wheel, shout of the horse, and the sounding chariot, horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses, dead bodies without names, and stumbles. Right. So you get the picture, right? It's this very dramatic description of what's going to happen, and it's sort of meant to be quite a terrifying picture of the judgment that's coming on Nineveh. And we know that's going to come in the form of the Babylonians. Come down to verse 6. Things start to get quite specific here in terms of the details of what's going to happen to the city. So in chapter 2 and verse 6, it says that the river gates are opened and the palace melts away. And then in verse 8, Nineveh is like a pool whose waters run away. Halt, halt, they cry, but none turns back. So Nineveh actually prided itself on the water systems that were actually established by Sennacherib when he made it the capital. Got a map there on the right, and it shows how the Kosa River, which was diverted by Sennacherib, ran straight through the middle of the city. And you can see how there's a moat around the city and there's some canals out there as well. All of this elaborate irrigation, and there was actually much more detail to it than that, was set up in the time of Sennacherib. Now, the New English Translation notes have this to say: according to classical tradition, that's the writers Diodorus and Xenophon, Greek writers, just before Nineveh fell, a succession of very high rainfalls deluged the area. The Kosa River swelled and the reservoir was breached. The waters rushed through the overloaded canal system, breaking a whole 20 stadies, or about 2.3 miles, 3.7 kilometers wide, in the city wall and flooding the city. When the waters receded, the Babylonians stormed into Nineveh and conquered the city. And that scenario seems to be corroborated by the archaeological evidence at the site. In fact, if you can see where the river there bends in the middle of the city, next to that mound of Kuyunyuk, that's actually where the royal palace was. So we can see how in a situation of a huge flood, that would not be very good for that palace. This is just one example, and I'm about to list off a few, of the way in which the prophecy of Nahum is God's way of very deliberately undermining everything that the Assyrians were proud of really taking apart in a polemic all of their rhetoric. Have a look at chapter 2 and verse 9. It says there, plunder the silver, plunder the gold. There is no end of the treasure or of the wealth of all precious things. This is very familiar language. This is exactly the kind of language that the Assyrians themselves used when describing about the cities that they conquered. And if you look through the book of Nahum and compare it to Assyrian annals and inscriptions, there's actually a very deliberate inversion of Assyrian rhetoric being done here. It's all being flipped on its head. So in Nahum chapter 1, verse 12, it says that the Assyrians will be cut down. That phrase "cut down" is actually a single Hebrew word, and it's normally used of the shearing of sheep. It's like they will be shorn. This is interesting when the Assyrian annals and inscriptions say things like, "All of his people I treated as a flock of sheep," or "I cut their throats like lambs." Sargon and Sennacherib use that kind of language. In chapter 1, verse 12, it says that the Assyrians will pass away. It's actually a word that's normally used of a flow of water trickling to a halt. It's used that way in Job. The Assyrians like to describe their armies as like a flood. Sargon says, "I destroyed them like a flood. I battered them into a heap of ruins." So the Assyrians, according to Nahum, that flood is going to trickle away into nothing. God says to the Israelites that "I will break the Assyrian yoke from off you." In the Assyrian annals of Sennacherib, he says that "I laid waste the large district of Judah and put the straps of my yoke upon Hezekiah its king." The same imagery is being used there. As we just read in chapter 2, verse 9, it says, "Plunder the silver, plunder the gold." Sennacherib specifically talks about taking from Hezekiah in Jerusalem 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver. Now that same treasure is going to be plundered back. And then in chapter 3, verse 12, God says, "All your fortresses are like fig trees with first ripe figs. If shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater." And Sargon said, "I let my army eat of their orchards, the date palms, their mainstay, the orchards, the wealth of their province, I cut down." And then at the end of chapter 3, it says there, "Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria. Your people are scattered on the mountains with none to gather them." And Sargon wrote a similar thing. He said, "I defeated them, and Sibu ran off like a shepherd whose sheep had been carried off, and he died." So you can see this is a very detailed takedown. And again, this perhaps might suggest that that Nahum was someone who was in some way familiar, whether he was a local or whether he was an exile, or for some reason he might have had some insight into the Assyrian annals and inscriptions, because all of this would have meant so much more to him and his audience with awareness of all of this significance behind the language. To look at it in a bit more detail, this is the description that in the annals of Sennacherib of what he did to Jerusalem. He says there, "As for Hezekiah, the terrifying splendor of my majesty overcame him, and the irregulars and picked troops which he had brought in to strengthen his royal city of Jerusalem deserted him. He had brought after me to Nineveh 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, as well as gems, antimony, jewels, large sandu stones, couches, and house chairs of ivory, elephant's hide, ivory, maple, boxwood, all kinds of valuable treasures, and his daughters, his harem, and his male and female musicians to me in Nineveh, my royal city. He sent his personal messenger to deliver the tribute and accept servitude." So we can see how this plundering attitude is being almost kind of parodied in the book of Nahum. It's all going to be flipped on the Assyrians' heads. We also get a bit more of this going on in a different way at the end of chapter 2, reading from verse 11 there. It says, "Where is the lion's den, the feeding place of the young lions, where the lion and lioness went, where his cubs were, with none to disturb? The lion tore enough for his cubs and strangled prey for his lionesses. He filled his caves with prey and his dens with torn flesh. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions." Lions were a favorite symbol and piece of imagery used by the Assyrians in their art and their propaganda. Ashurbanipal, who was the last great king of Assyria, was often depicted hunting lions, which kind of symbolized his might and supremacy over chaos. Lions were sort of a symbol of chaos because of their sort of uncontrollable violence. But now that same imagery has been turned against him. It's kind of like the hunter has become the hunted. And in that relief you can see on the screen there, you've actually got two different versions of Ashurbanipal. I think there's actually a few more as well. It's, you know, he quite liked this version of himself. You can see him in the top row there, sort of throttling a lion with one hand and running it through with a sword in the other. And then below that, he's the man on horseback, spearing a lion as he rides past. So we can see that the Assyrian propaganda here is being, you know, very much criticized in the book of Nahum. What I think we can take from this is that God is not interested in upholding the age-to-age narrative of imperial conquest. And again, the non-specific language in this book helps to generalize this message to not just Assyria, but to every expansionist empire through history. God is not impressed by military might, and you know, there's been Christians who have fallen into the trap of misinterpreting the military success of great empires and nations as God's approval. The British, for instance, with their empire, or even America to the current day, there's plenty of fundamentalist Christians in the United States who believe that America's military supremacy is a sign that God approves of America as a Christian nation, and that he thinks that they are the best and that they sort of, you know, deserve to have military success. What I think we can take from Nahum is that God is actually not interested in this at all. Doesn't impress him. The imagery of the lions also is significant in terms of Bible prophecy. We know that Daniel chapter 7 picks up on this kind of imagery. The first of the beasts there, Daniel 7 verse 4, it says that the first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. So we have that lion in 2 stages there, the wings removed and made to stand up. Some actually interpret that as the shift in power between the culturally similar Assyria and Babylon. They sort of interpret that the lion with the wings is Assyria, and then the lion without the wings standing up with the heart of a man is Babylon. Some have interpreted that to mean that Babylon was a more humane power than Assyria, which is interesting. And you know, maybe that's how Assyria was represented in Scripture. It's worth noting that Assyria's reputation for aggression and cruelty can be a little exaggerated at times, though. There's a couple of reasons why the Assyrians were very known for their brutality. Number one was really just because of their unprecedented expansionism, the fact that they were the first real empire to cover the whole of the Near East, and that, of course, came with a lot of violence, and also to kind of reinforce that, you know, their reputation. They had a lot of propaganda. They depicted these scenes in their reliefs of intense violence, like, you know, the one that's on the screen there, but people, not animals. So I would suggest that Assyria was probably not significantly more violent than other expansionist empires of history. We know that all, you know, expansion of empires comes at a horrible cost of bloodshed, whether that's the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans. They all did pretty horrible, inhumane things in their process of expanding. Let's come across to chapter 3 now. So we read through a bit of chapter 3 before with that auditory and visual imagery. There's this, especially at the start of chapter 3, there's this kind of staccato phrasing going on. It's not even necessarily, you know, complete sentences here. It's just these scattered phrases being thrown around to heighten this mood of chaos. If you read from verse 2 there, the crack of the whip, rumble of the wheel, galloping horse, bounding chariot, horsemen charging, flashing sword, glittering spear, hosts of slain, heaps of corpses. It's this very sort of rapid fire series of descriptions highlighting the violence and chaos here. And it almost actually echoes the nation's own propaganda, kind of making them sound very violent and aggressive. But then in verse 4, it all kind of comes crashing down. What's all of this for? All for the countless whorings of the prostitute, graceful and deadly charms, who betrays nations with her whorings and peoples with her charms. So the military ferocity and plunder of which the Assyrians were so proud is reduced here to the behavior of a prostitute. So again, God is very unimpressed with this behavior. Come down to verse 8 there. And as we said before, this is part of what helps us to date this prophecy. It refers there to the destruction of Thebes. God says to Nineveh, "Are you better than Thebes that sat by the Nile with water around her, her rampart a sea and water her wall?" The Assyrians had destroyed Thebes in 663 BC, and that was, as we can see there, a city that, like Nineveh, had relied on watercourses as part of its defenses from the Nile River there instead of the Tigris as it was at Nineveh. And now Nineveh, who had managed to overcome those water defenses, was now going to face the same fate. This sort of, the irony of this situation is a reminder to us that God seems to reserve a special kind of disdain for the things that people trust in the way that he deserves to be trusted. And we see this through the prophecies of the Old Testament as well to Israel and Judah. All those times when they relied on other nations and those kind of alliances instead of trusting in him, really attracted the disdain of God, and they faced pretty harsh judgment for that sort of thing. It's of course a warning to us to think about what are the things in our lives that we put in the place where God should be. What are the things that we trust in times of trouble, when really that's the spot that should be reserved for God. We'll come down to verse 15 now, getting close to the end. So in verse 15 to 17, we get a bit of a picture of the bureaucracy of Nineveh. It says there, "The fire will devour you, the sword will cut you off, it will devour you like the locust. Multiply yourselves like the locust, multiply like the grasshopper. You increased your merchants more than the stars of the heavens. The locust spreads its wings and flies away. Your princes are like grasshoppers, your scribes like clouds of locust, settling on the fences in a day of cold. When the sun rises, they fly away. No one knows where they are." So we get a few different descriptions of Assyrian sort of ranks and officers there. Talks about the merchants, the princes, the scribes. Assyria actually had quite an elaborate system of government. You can see that pyramid diagram to the left there shows how it was all laid out. On the right there, that's actually a relief depicting not a city, but a military camp. And again, you can see how tight a ship the Assyrians were proud of running, with all the different roles and officers being taken care of. But what is described here in verse 18 is quite important. It says there, "Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria, your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains with no one to gather them." So we can see that this elaborate bureaucracy of the Assyrians was going to collapse, and it was going to just demonstrate a complete lack of loyalty and stability. All of these people they were relying on to keep things running, they were just going to run for the hills and try and save their own skin. And the Assyrian pride that they had in their system of government is a good reminder that we should never assume that we're at the pinnacle of history, which is probably how the Assyrians felt. They felt like they had everything under control. They had this unprecedented empire. They had this really elaborate system of government that kept everything under control, but it was all going to fall apart. And it's very easy for us, sitting here in 2024, to think that surely, the world can't get more advanced than this. Surely we've reached the pinnacle. But, think back 100 years, and I'm sure they felt the same way. They developed their motor cars and their cinemas and all of this new scientific technology. They probably felt like they were at the pinnacle of history as well. But we look back now and it all seems rather quaint and old-fashioned. We should never assume that we're at the pinnacle of history. God, again, is not impressed by our advances in politics or technology and things like that. We can't even begin to imagine how God will operate his kingdom. It's going to be something quite over and above anything we could possibly imagine. It's noteworthy as well that it talks there about the shepherds of Assyria. It's actually part of the standard titulary of the Assyrian king to call him the shepherd. That was one of his titles. But here, God is condemning the Assyrian king, who was Shin-shar-ishkun, as a bad shepherd. And the Assyrian people are going to be left like sheep without a shepherd here. This is worth contrasting because we know that the shepherd is a very important role in the Bible with people like David and Christ. So, for instance, in 1 Chronicles 21, it says, David said to God, was it not I who gave command to number the people? It is I who have sinned and done great evil. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand, O Lord my God, be against me and against my father's house. But do not let the plague be on your people. So we've got that very powerful example there of David taking responsibility. He's, showing what a true shepherd does, putting the sheep's life above his own. Quite the opposite of what would happen in Assyria, where all of the nobles are going to fly off like grasshoppers once the invasion comes, leaving the people to the mercy of the Babylonians. And of course, the same attitude was exhibited by Christ in his ministry. Matthew 9, verse 36 says that when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And then we come to the end of the book of Jonah. Verse 19. There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you. Or upon whom has not come your unceasing evil? I said that there was another connection to the book of Jonah, other than just being about Nineveh and a prophecy to the Gentiles. It's also, interestingly, the only other book apart from Jonah in the Bible to end with a question. I wonder, this might be interpreting a little bit too loosely, but I wonder if there's some sense that the Gentiles, because Nahum and Jonah are the only prophecies specifically to the Gentiles are perhaps left as a bit of an open question in the Old Testament, a question that's going to be answered by Christ. What's going to happen to the Ninevites and to the Assyrians and to the Gentiles and all of the people? So that really brings us to the end of what I wanted to look at tonight with Nahum. We've sort of zoomed through and we've picked out some key themes and ideas, but just to wrap things up, I think what's really clear from the book here is that God is really unimpressed with the pride of Nineveh. We know from Proverbs 6 that God has this attitude. It says there, these 6 things the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood. So the first thing on that list, a proud look, is definitely something that the Assyrians exhibited. And the hands that shed innocent blood were also one of their characteristics. These are things that God really didn't stand for. We might, just because we've got a couple of minutes, just because this works as a really good summary of God's whole attitude towards Assyria, given that he'd used the Assyrians to punish his people, but that doesn't mean that he approved of them. Have a look at Isaiah 10. Johnny, do you want to read Isaiah 10 verses 5 to 15?
Assyria, the club I use to vent my anger is as good as dead. The cudgel with which I angrily punish. I sent him against a godless nation. I ordered him to attack the people with whom I was angry, to take plunder and to carry away loot, to trample them down like dirt in the streets. But he does not agree with this. His mind does not reason this way, for his goal is to destroy and to eliminate many nations. Indeed, he says, are not my officials all kings? Is not Calneh like Carchemish, Hamath like Arpad, Samaria like Damascus? I overpowered kingdoms ruled by idols, whose carved images were more impressive than Jerusalem's or Samaria's. As I have done to Samaria and its idols, so I will do to Jerusalem and its idols. But when the sovereign master finishes judging Mount Zion and Jerusalem, then I will punish the king of Assyria for what he has proudly planned and for the arrogant attitude he displays. For he says, by my strong hand I have accomplished this. By my strategy that I devised, I invaded the territory of nations and looted their storehouses. Like a mighty conqueror, I brought down rulers. My hand discovered the wealth of the nations as if it were in a nest, as one gathers up abandoned eggs. I gathered up the whole earth. There was no wing flapping or open mouth chirping. Does an axe exalt itself over the one who wields it, or a saw magnify itself over the one who cuts with it? As if a scepter should brandish the one who raises it, or a staff should lift up what is not made of wood.
Great, thank you very much there. And that final verse again really emphasizes God's disdain for Assyria. You know, they served a purpose in His plan and for His, I guess, the judgment of His people Israel. But that did not mean that He approved of their actions and gave them a license to have this eternal empire that they desired. And to wrap things up, I really liked this little summary from the NIV Study Bible, which I think, pulls the message of this book together well. God's righteous and just kingdom will ultimately triumph. The kingdoms built on wickedness and tyranny must eventually fall, as Assyria did.